Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our CIISec Masterclass this afternoon. Happy Friday. As you can see, this session is around cyber and information security vulnerabilities on the humanitarian frontline. Before we make a start with the introductions, I'll use this bit of time to run you through our house rules. If you're a CIISec member or you've attended some of our events before, then you'll be familiar with how these run. But just as a reminder, or for anyone who's new, welcome. You will be muted throughout this webinar, but please do ask as many questions as you want to our speaker, Olivia, today, and our host will be able to moderate and pick those up with you. If you really want to ask questions anonymously, then you can do so, but this is a very safe space, so please don't hold off. We want as much interaction going on as possible. I think that's when these sessions work best. Just other final thing to mention is that if you do have any problems this afternoon, which hopefully you don't, then please do let us know at support@ciisec.org, and another colleague of mine will be able to hopefully help you with anything that's going on. Something else to mention is that the webinar is being recorded this afternoon as well. So if you do have to drop off for any reason, you can always leave your question in the chat and we can pick that up. And obviously we'll send the link to the recording out to you afterwards. So please don't panic. You can watch this webinar and catch up and all of our previous masterclasses as well. So if you're a CIISec member, do pop onto your account and have a look at our past events too. For anyone who joined us a little bit late, I'll just repeat myself there. This is the CIISec Masterclass focusing on cyber and information security vulnerabilities on the humanitarian frontline. And today's webinar is hosted by John Ayler, who is our Northwest branch leader. John currently works for BT and has 20 years of experience in information security. His current role is that he works for BT Security Advisory Services team, and he's a team leader, which has a focus on new technology adoption. So I'll hand over to John, who will introduce our speaker, Olivia. And as I say, please do get your questions into us.
Thank you. So I've got the easy job today. I'm just handling the questions at the end and introducing Olivia. So we've seen in the news perhaps recently, people giving away personal information on the promise of chocolate. We've certainly seen, similar stories over the year. You get interviewed in the street. Somebody asks you, what's your mother's maiden name? And they work you around and they'll find stuff out about you. And I don't know about you, but you think, oh, really? They're daft. Why have they done that? You shouldn't have done that. You don't deserve what's coming to you. But imagine you're in a conflict zone and in front of you is safety and behind you is danger, either from physical threats, the way the world, volcanoes, people running around with the intent of killing you just for who you are. Would you give your personal information away to seek safety in that case? Of course you would. And you'd be hoping that those who took the information looked after it responsibly. Certainly not giving it either deliberately or accidentally to those who seek to harm you. Olivia Williams, our speaker today, has 8 years experience working in fragile conflict and violence zones. She's worked with human rights NGOs, government agencies and international development agencies. She's experienced how personal data is really handled in these high-risk situations. In 2020, she completed her doctorate. She wrote a PhD thesis around the interface of information security, cybersecurity, risk and privacy in the humanitarian frontline. So it's really easy for me. The expert on the subject is Olivia. So Dr. Olivia, it's over to you, and I'll be back for questions towards the end. So if you've got any questions, submit them as we go, and we'll ask towards the end. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you to Sophie and John for the housekeeping details and the warm welcome, and also to CIISec for hosting this event. And to all of you in attendance to this event, welcome to the CIISec Masterclass, which is entitled Cyber and Information Security Vulnerabilities on the Humanitarian Frontline. Next, please, Sophie. So as John kindly mentioned there, I'm Olivia Williams, and the topics referenced during this class are based upon the years of experience I have from data collection across emergency response environments. And this experience stems from my experience responding to natural disasters in places such as Malawi, Nepal, the Philippines, as well as to man-made conflicts encircling Syria and deployed to the Kurdistan region of northern Iraq and also to Turkey. Based upon my data handling observations and experiences across those domains, I then completed a PhD at American University in Washington, DC, where I conducted research on the information security habits of aid workers operating on these front lines. And my research was conducted, for your information, between 2018 and 2021, so it's pretty recent. And I was looking at the cyber and InfoSec related concerns, but also directly related issues of privacy, confidentiality, and real world harms. So my deep interest in this subject began in 2013, when I first deployed to the Philippines to assist victims of Typhoon Haiyan. You may recall that that was a pretty devastating and long-lasting series of sort of ongoing devastating natural disasters, starting with the typhoon, and then there were landslides and also a tsunami as well, which devastated huge tracts of coastal regions, and then also affected inland areas as well. Many people died, unfortunately, and communities were sort of devastated, their livelihoods, their homes, food resources, clean drinking water, sanitation, all these kinds of things. So it was a really eye-opening experience for me, where I learned a lot on sort of, in a very short period of time. So during that deployment, and then others in more recent years, I observed the introduction of all kinds of information communication technologies into the day-to-day running of country offices, as well as data collection and data handling during contact with the beneficiary community. Beneficiary personal data was collected, processed, and then disseminated in numerous ways. And of course, that is still very much the case today, actually even more so as we continue to emerge and evolve into a sort of an electric datafied society. Aid workers and those in the more powerful positions in those environments have, of course, some control over each of these data-driven activities. However, for those in less developed areas, and certainly for beneficiaries, particularly those who rely on international or local aid, they have little to no control over how their personal data is handled and used. And in fact, receiving aid is for the most part dependent upon beneficiaries handing over, as John said, handing over their personal data. Next, please, Sophie. So although collecting basic data are common to almost all emergency response NGOs, questions posed to beneficiaries can cover an absolutely enormous range of topics. And I'm just going to run through some of those for you so you get an idea of how wide and widespread those topics are. So they could be asked about the profiles of their family members, including their ages, names, dates of birth, languages spoken, disabilities, their arrival pattern, which includes place of origin, point of entry, arrival data, such as the kind of paperwork they have with them and the vehicles and they might have used to come to that destination, registration with the state, and reason for leaving the previous location, shelter and hygiene needs of that particular individual or family, current or type of shelter required within a camp, for example, their access to safe water and medicines, whether they have any access, whether they have any needs in that regard, protection issues concerning the sense of safety felt by the beneficiary in relation to the host community and locals, which we can see is certainly an issue between Russia and Ukraine tensions at the moment, and safety amongst others residing in a camp or shelter. And this is particularly related to things like gender, safety around whether those of a particular gender feel comfortable with another, and maybe there's some protection required due to that gender identity, religion, ethnicity, political alignment, the kind of foods that they consume. Coping strategies is also a newly emerging area of interest for a lot of NGOs, and sort of drawing lists up about how beneficiaries cope, the kind of coping strategies they implement themselves when trying to escape and evade a threat, and also what kind of humanitarian assistance they may or may not have received to date. Next, please, Sophie. So with personal and sensitive data, including biometric data collected by NGOs in a wide variety of ways, sometimes they use paper and pen, still, sometimes they use electronic devices, and these electronic files or digital dossiers are created and proliferated by personal and sensitive information. They are entered into humanitarian systems and then are widely shared between NGOs and other authorities and entities. And it's absolutely undeniable that this data has made the humanitarian sector more efficient in its delivery of aid, and also fostered a much better understanding of the needs across the beneficiary population. It has made NGOs faster in their response time, and that, along with climate and geopolitical data, has led to the sector being able to track and in some cases even predict a population's aid requirements even before they're needed, which is incredible. But the personal data of beneficiaries, whether they be refugees, internally displaced persons, or migrants, also has the potential to further the agendas of others whose priorities may actively harm vulnerable populations. Next, please, Sophie. So these others, with an assortment of interests, may actually be in close proximity to the beneficiaries, such as local NGOs, intergovernmental organisations, or international NGOs, and they often claim philanthropic interests in vulnerable populations. And there's others again, such as third parties who might offer, for example, online data storage facilities, specialist data management expertise, or biometric technologies, which they offer then to these disaster environments to collect information and track and trace these populations. And those more sort of latter examples may, for example, possess more commercial interests. And then there are what I just very generically call the others, such as international criminals or terrorist groups whose political agendas might be satisfied actually by obtaining personal data from these vulnerable beneficiary populations. And of course, it's not always that clear cut though, is it? It's entities often have very complex agendas and a mix of interests. So there may be commercial and political, for example, or maybe commercial and philanthropic, for example. So this aside, what I'm sure will be of absolutely no surprise to anyone listening to this masterclass is that events which exploit the digital vulnerabilities central to NGO operations are increasing. They are damaging and in some cases directly affect the viability of ongoing aid delivery. And fundamentally, they can directly harm the world's most vulnerable. Next, please, Sophie. So I just wanted to give you some examples of the latest attacks on NGOs, and some of these I'm sure you've already heard about in the news or in conversations. So in 2021, and it carried on into 2022, the FBI reported that there was an undisclosed, well, the name was undisclosed of this NGO, but there was an MFA exploitation where hackers escalated their privileges themselves to administrator level and then disabled MFA to access, so multi-factor authentication, to access the NGO's cloud storage and email accounts. In 2022, the ICRC was hacked, and hackers took and revealed the personal details of more than 500,000 people worldwide. In 2021, the VSA in Australia was hit by a ransomware attack, which encrypted vital operational data and severely affected their ongoing operations. In 2020, the World Health Organization was hacked, and 450 active email addresses and passwords were leaked online, including thousands of email addresses belonging to partner organization staff. Again in 2020, the Philadelphia Food Bank was hit by a ransomware attack, and that affected food handouts for many desperate Americans who had been severely affected by COVID-19, losing their jobs, their homes, this kind of thing. So that had a really severe impact on them. And then also Save the Children and Roots of Peace experienced spear phishing attacks costing over $1.3 million American dollars to rectify. Next, please. So there's this sort of term that's been coined with these emerging types of attacks, which is the weaponization of humanitarian data. And I wanted to share a few of those with you as well. So there are attacks, which we just discussed there or just shown, that absolutely do make the front pages of well-known newspapers, but there are also those that don't. And the next sort of 4 or 5 are going to be examples of those you may not have heard of. So in 2015, humanitarian databases were attacked, exposing the personal information of Syrians fleeing from the Assad regime. And this data referenced Syrians who had been included in humanitarian needs assessments or received financial assistance from NGOs. During that same attack, the cyber threat group also took refugee application documents, including scans of ID cards, exposing the Syrian refugees hoping to escape into Turkey and other bordering countries. And the personal information of aid workers working to assist those refugees was also obtained during that attack also. And then in 2016, again in Syria, a medical aid worker's computer was hacked. And this resulted in an operating theatre being bombed, and that shut down the entire facility, which affected not only existing patients there, but would-be patients who were sort of out in the field needing expert help. Next, please, Sophie. So in 2017, NGOs, some very large NGOs, household name types, were collecting biometric data on the Rohingya community fleeing Myanmar into Bangladesh, but it was subsequently identified that the Bangladesh authorities were using in part some of this information to restrain or withhold access of these refugees into some areas of the country, and disallowing them or not giving them access to international refugee aid and refugee status. And some have even warned since that biometric data can be used as a genetic marker, meaning that an entire genealogical tree, not simply one individual, could potentially be identified. And that's sort of an emerging research ongoing at the moment, so I'll be interested to see how that unfolds. 2018, beneficiary data was exposed when a vulnerability in the cloud-based server used by an NGO in West Africa was exploited, revealing the names, photographs, family details, and more, including map coordinates of their individual locations of more than 8,000 families. And then there's other unverifiable reports, for example, details about the publication of HIV positive status, pregnant women which led to them being, it's said, led to them being severely beaten, although of course this particular one has been difficult to verify, so I put that one with a slight asterisk. So at this point, it's important, I think, to bring the concept of beneficiary privacy back into the fold, especially as cybersecurity and privacy are interconnected or intertwined. But as I did this research, I had to ask myself, what is privacy? And exactly, we think we have well, certainly I did, I thought I had a good understanding, a good hold on what it was. But when I actually came to have to sort of describe what it was, I needed to do some more background research. So I thought it would be useful in this masterclass just to cover that off quickly. So next slide, please, Sophie. So we have things like GDPR, EU-US Privacy Shield, HIPAA in the States, and then further afield legislation like the Data Protection Law in Bahrain and APEC Privacy Framework throughout Asia. And these laws, of course, are created and exist to protect, but protecting privacy in the information age, where the internet, digital technologies and global connectivity and surveillance states actually threaten to invade our privacy. It's not ensuring that privacy is maintained and upheld, and everyone's privacy is respected. This is not an easy task. So fundamentally, privacy is an individual's ability to regulate information about themselves, maintain control over their personal information, control the access that others have to them or the data, choose whether or not to participate. And then the key for us all to understand privacy is to acknowledge that privacy is not a static concept, but is actually contextual. And you can see different contexts between West and East, between different sort of entities, powerful, less powerful. Even some studies show that there's a divide, privacy divide between genders. So there's some really interesting exploration to be done there. We're not going to do that today, don't worry. And also confidentiality, it's worth mentioning as well, I think is defined as preserving authorized restrictions on information access and disclosure, including means for protecting personal privacy and proprietary information, and that's NIST 2010. There may be an update to that, but some of you may know better than me. Next, please, Sophie. So to give you a better understanding of the study that I did, and hence then the findings that resulted from the study, I thought it was useful to give you sort of a loose idea of the framework that I was working within for this. So given the contextual nature of privacy, I used an academic privacy framework which posits that harm to the individual can occur due to the privacy problems inherent to digital and electronic communications. And to understand the context of any given reality, this framework asks that we conduct a thorough mapping of the contextual landscape. And it's through this mapping that I was able to sort of achieve the findings that we'll come into later. This mapping was sort of provided to me in a sort of quite a positive, practical terminology. So someone compared it to a cartographer mapping a geographical landscape, but also with the caveat that it needs to include the mapping of practices within it, which we'll come on to. Therefore, the mapping of three main information-driven activities of information collection, information processing, and information dissemination was what I looked at in depth, and was able to map the humanitarian data landscape to the best of my ability. Next, please, Sophie. With this inherent and integral to this mapping exercise, I was also asking three primary questions. So first of all, what do NGOs say that they do to protect beneficiary data? And what do aid workers say they do to protect the beneficiary data that they collect? I had a hunch from having worked in the sector for several years that these things would sort of perhaps not be so far as sort of polar opposites, but there would certainly be sort of problem areas where the policy couldn't be mapped to the practical environment. So this is what I wanted to get a better understanding of. I'd seen a lot of that happening in the context that I'd worked in. And I was sort of asking myself, is this an anomaly? Are these experiencing all these experiences that everyone's having? I sort of really, it was sort of my passion project at that point, and I really wanted to better understand what was going on. And then with those findings, I wanted to ask the question, based upon what I found, how are beneficiaries harmed by humanitarian information activities? So we'll move on to methods next, please, Sophie. And one more, please. There we are. So I used 3 methods to conduct this exploration, rather into sort of the deep, dark crevices of the data landscape in the humanitarian sector. And my analysis consisted of content analysis, of NGO data protection and policy documents, then an anonymous electronic survey aimed at aid workers with deployment experience. That was an important caveat with the deployment experience. And then to answer my third question about how beneficiaries might be harmed by these ongoing activities, I used a literature review, the findings from a literature review and the findings from an electronic survey, as well as the content analysis, to then go back and ask a series of questions and conduct some interviews with aid workers themselves. And that provided the opportunity for me to dig sort of really, really deep into the sort of the granularity of what was going on. Next slide, please. So again, to give you some context, some of you may be aware, but others maybe not. I had to sort of identify how I was going to deal with or identify NGOs whose documents I wanted to take a look at. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of NGOs, so I needed to figure out a way to make my case studies, to narrow down my case studies and look at a small number. So I tried to bound the study in the most logical and useful way. And this was done by identifying NGOs who operate under the Humanitarian Emergency Response System, which is the UN cluster system. So although not all NGOs who can be found working in an emergency response environment actually operate under that UN cluster, the majority do. And it's widely accepted really that it's the first point of contact for NGOs arriving and aid workers arriving in country. You go to the cluster meetings for your particular focus of your NGO. It might be shelter, it might be protection, it might be education. So it seemed to me like a good port of call to start there and then whittle it down a little bit. So the 11 cluster groups each focus on a different beneficiary need, such as shelter, health, food, education. And under the UN cluster system, there are currently 193, well, there were when I did the study and finished a year ago, 193 active aid organisation members. So then I wanted to narrow the case study down a bit more, and I added aid organisations. I looked at aid organisations who identified as anything other than an NGO. So this might be sort of a private company, private security company, private protection company, might be a for-profit organisation. And all of those ones, I removed the names from the list. Then to narrow further, any NGO which did not collect beneficiary data was also removed from the list. So some are actually there just to provide a service and not provide aid as such. So the electronic telecommunication organisation, Télécoms Sans Frontières, for example, they do not collect data on beneficiaries. They're there to provide a sort of GPS telephone communication service. So then I had a sort of a master list, and I put this into a hierarchy based upon the NGOs who were most active within that cluster, within the cluster, down to those who were least active, and that was identified by how many partners the NGOs had in that context. So, by this point, there were far fewer NGOs than the 193 there had been at the beginning. Yet I also decided I need to narrow things down further. So then I looked at which of the remaining NGOs on the list actually had policy and data protection and cybersecurity documents available. A lot of them are starting to really align with sort of transparency and accountability. So a lot of these things that they have publicly available online, lesser for obvious reasons about their cybersecurity practices and policies, but there were some of those as well. So that led me to 10 NGOs, and it was those 10 NGOs that I used as case studies. Next slide, please, Sophie. So from those 10 NGOs, don't worry, we are coming on to the findings soon. From those 10 NGOs, 39 documents were obtained, and that totaled 848, it's worth repeating, 848 pages. And that formed the content of data protection policies, codes of conduct, global communication policies, security policies, photography guidelines, aid worker handbooks, and data-related field kits. Next slide, please, Sophie. So for that second method I used, which was the electronic survey, where it's worth mentioning as well that participants remained anonymous. A lot of the aid workers had told me that they were very nervous about adding their name to their comments and responses to the survey. So it's very early on, I sort of identified that it would need to be anonymous, and that worked out really well. The survey was populated by 42 questions, and I sort of identified what these questions needed to be about and how to word the questions, because I conducted a literature review on topics sort of circling this humanitarian landscape. And I also had a good understanding of the problems central to the humanitarian landscape, data-related problems from having completed prior deployments. And then once I'd created the survey, I posted a link to, some of you may know of it, it's called 50 Shades of Aid. It's a Facebook group followed by aid workers and interacted with on a daily basis. It's actually a really, really active, community-driven page on Facebook that's populated by aid worker members from all over the world. I also put a link to the survey on the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and their protection community page, the TechSoup Security, Privacy and Safety Forum, and I also sent it to existing contacts I had within the humanitarian community. Next slide, please. So the final method I used for this study was a series of interviews. So at the end of the survey, the last question was, would you be willing to have a conversation with me offline about some of your responses and be able to give me some more information about your experiences? So 36 participants of the survey said they'd be willing to do that, and they shared their emails with me. Each of those participants responded within a week. I gave them 1 week to respond, and all of those who responded within this time period were interviewed and waived their anonymity for this portion of the study. So these interviewees currently work as Regional Director of Intersos, the Head of Technology and Emergencies at Télécoms Sans Frontières, the Information Management Project Manager and Data Protection Officer at Carton, based in France, and also an independent software and machine learning architect with more than 10 years of experience in the aid sector. On to the findings now, Sophie. Next slide, please. Thank you. That's it. Perfect. So what did we find? So the content analysis portion of the study where I explored NGO documents gave me a really good understanding of what NGOs and senior management think needs to be included in policy documents. provided me also the chance to look at sort of several core topics, like what kept emerging to the surface as areas of particular sort of mention within these policy documents. And I also looked at the privacy, mention of privacy and confidentiality within these documents, given that those are sort of central tenets to cybersecurity, information security more generally. So this initial exploration identified that both terms were referenced by all NGOs. However, there was a wide variance in the frequency of these terms across NGO documents, with one NGO referencing privacy 60 times, but confidentiality only once, whilst another referenced confidentiality 49 times and privacy only 5 times. And this trend occurred with all of the other NGOs also. And this suggested that there was a preference from each NGO towards one or other of the terms. 6 NGOs were primarily concerned with confidentiality, with the remaining 4 concerned with privacy. And given the definition of these 2 terms, privacy being concerned with protecting the individual and confidentiality with protecting data, this may suggest that the majority of NGOs are primarily interested in controlling data access over a beneficiary's ability to maintain control over their own data and therefore retain their own privacy. So there's an interesting nuance, difference in nuance going on there. And I also found that these 2 terms are often conflated, and this is a real problem because it creates ambiguity, not only around the distinction between these terms and their true meaning, but also in the steps needing to be taken to ensure their separate application and the practical processes required to ensure that they are upheld. Next, please, Sophie. So, only half of the NGOs analysed named a data protection legislation, such as GDPR or the HIPAA or Privacy Shield. And where responsibility towards data was concerned, sweeping statements about data management and handling being everybody's responsibility were relatively common, which I don't disagree with, but what it also showed that there was a real lack of responsibility taken by in-country office managers and senior managers within NGOs to really help aid workers on the front line understand what their responsibility was towards protecting data. They really did put the onus of awareness of even regional data protection legislation, which is an absolute minefield anyway, and compliance squarely onto the shoulders of aid workers themselves, which is just an impossible ask for people who are already dealing with, you know, vulnerable people and emergencies in those kinds of context zones. So it also became clear, which I thought was quite interesting, that NGOs showed preference towards protecting data at particular stages of their data handling activities. For example, protecting data at a dissemination or sharing phase was referenced much more frequently than data collection or data processing. And combining this finding with others, there's a strong suggestion that discourse and instruction around protecting data at this dissemination stage takes precedent over protections at collection and processing stages. And it became clear that protective cultures around each of the data collection, data processing and data dissemination activities are really out of kilter. And protecting data seems to only really be more meaningfully considered and implemented once data is intentionally shared with others rather than other opportunities during the data lifecycle. Next, please. We'll run through this bit really quickly because I want to get on to the e-survey findings. So 75% of examples of harms occurring from field activity came from one NGO alone. There was very, very sort of sparse reference to the kind of harms that might occur from mishandling data through any of the policy documents. And although the word harm was used at least once by NGOs, references to do no harm, which is supposed to be a central and guiding ethic for the humanitarian community, was only referenced by half of the NGO case studies. And actually, in fact, of that half, very few NGOs expanded upon the term and therefore failed to connect the principle to day-to-day humanitarian data-related activities. Only 20% of the case study NGOs I looked at named a type of threat actor and a threat type and a possible harm as a consequence. So there was a real disconnect between the whole kind of threat landscape, you know, of risk, cyber threat actor, threat type, risk and harm. So this suggests that the do no harm principle fails to truly land within these organisations, and there's a disconnect between insufficiently secured data possibly leading to a harm or harms. So we'll go on to the next slide, please. And the next one again with the e-survey findings. So this is when I spoke directly to, this is when I first gathered the information or comments and feedback from the e-survey from aid workers. So respondents came from 28 countries, from North and South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. And I had responses from 180 aid workers, all with deployment experiences. Their ages span 5 decades, with the most from a particular age bracket being between the ages of 35 and 44, and the least being the ages of 65 and 74. Many had worked in this sector between 6 and 10 years, with a few having been doing this line of work for between 16 and 20 years. And 86 participants said they'd worked for at least one of the 10 case study NGOs, but they also listed many more NGOs they'd worked for, an additional 81 in fact, which meant that the information I was able to gather directly from the aid worker community spanned over what's 86 plus 81, over 150 NGOs from across the world. So from this e-survey, I found that many aid workers use their own personal devices to collect, process and share beneficiary data, and for the most part had not been asked not to do so by their organisations. They also said that personal and organisation-owned devices are sometimes kept in locations where unauthorised persons could access them. They said that although electronic devices were often protected by a password or PIN code, as well as hidden in physical locations, AV equipment, although also hidden often, were not digitally protected. Email was the most frequent means of sharing beneficiary data with others, but physical handovers of USB sticks containing personal and sensitive data and paper beneficiary files were also common, and sharing personal data over messaging apps and during phone calls were also relatively common. When I asked about their confidence in restricting other people's electronic access to data, only some felt confident that they could do this. Actually, it was less than 50%. Asking about how they ensured that data would be protected by other NGOs whose beneficiary data had been passed on to, they said that they just trusted that other NGOs and other partners in those contexts would look after the data, and they'd used no other form of checking. So we're going towards the end here, so I really want to focus on this bit. Aid workers were asked about their knowledge about cyber attacks as well, and attack surfaces, and they indicated that they would be able to explain malware and password attacks. However, the majority responded that they had never heard of whaling, farming, man-in-the-middle or cyber drive-by attacks, with only a few replying that they could explain spear phishing and eavesdropping attacks. And although there are a relatively large volume of material in the public domain which reports that NGOs are targeted by cyber threat actors, when I asked them to respond to the statement, cyber attackers purposefully attack NGOs, the majority responded that they weren't sure if that was the case. Emergency response aid workers also indicated that hotel Wi-Fi was the most common internet connection point used to share beneficiary data with colleagues and other organisations. However, as geo-targeting or targeting of people in specific locations is becoming a favourite attack vector, organisation-held data has been and continues to be exploited via these connection points. Next, please. So when they were asked if they believed NGOs to be purposefully targeted by cyber threat actors, the majority of aid workers said that they weren't sure, and even some said that they thought that this was not the case. When I asked about their types of cyber attack, about their knowledge of types of cyber attack, the answers indicated that overall, cyber attacks are little understood by aid workers. When I said that, asked them about data lifecycle, they said that the need to protect beneficiary data throughout the data lifecycle was clearly understood, but some responded that protecting data was only sometimes necessary, and a few replied that it was never necessary. Aid workers believed that securing data during collection and dissemination activities was less important than during its processing. So there's an interesting distinction there. And importantly, when I asked whether they felt that their NGO policy, data security and data protection policy documents were applicable to the field, most indicated that they thought that this was unrealistic, which wasn't a surprise to me. I think we're probably heading towards a time where I need to be thinking about mentioning a couple of things before we wrap up. So if, Sophie, we can move on to the interview finding aid worker comments, which I think is 3 slides beyond. Perfect, thank you. So the few things I thought was worth mentioning here. So one aid worker said that protocols set out by HQ don't take into account the challenges of being somewhere with only 2G internet and 1 hour of electricity. And if the protocols are designed in a way that make frontline workers' jobs harder, they're going to be completely ignored or circumvented. Another said, because we don't have funders who fund cybersecurity and information security policies, practices, workshops, training, this kind of thing within our organisations, we have to sort of make do and mend as well in some circumstances. So they said we use random Excel sheets as substitute databases for monitoring and evaluations. And these are often full of phone numbers, names, other identifier beneficiary details. These are easily accessed with no encryption. And one person said, one of the main problems is that our proposals have the very best GDPR compliances, but our practices not so much. Others said they shared hundreds of handwritten sheets of beneficiary data to HQ via WhatsApp, and that some beneficiary data is more protected over others. So it's pretty interesting. And then if we can go, Sophie, on to the humanitarian data harm wheel. Thank you. This is a really, I think we'll end on this. This is a really, really simple sort of wheel that I created, which I sort of am trying to suggest to people put in their humanitarian data policy handbooks, you know, their aid worker handbooks, their training, their workshops, just to remind people that they really need to have a clear understanding of how beneficiaries, sort of the life cycle around how beneficiaries can be harmed. So people need to have a better understanding of threat actors, who within those particular emergency response domains might have a vested interest in obtaining beneficiary data. What are the threats? What kind of threats might they use or attacks might they use to obtain that kind of information, and when? What's the risk? So what's the likelihood of those occurring? And of course, there are risk matrices which we can use to help to identify that. And then really importantly, continuing that loop around and connecting the dots right through to the harm, saying, well, what's likely to happen to these beneficiaries or what could happen to these beneficiaries if their personal information, often sensitive information, was released and wasn't controlled and was accessed by parties who we may not wish to have access. And that harm section is the really difficult bit that people seem to forget about, that once the beneficiary is out of the way, once we've collected the data from them, once they've received their aid, that they're okay, they're on a journey to sort of being helped and being put back on their feet, or helped to sort of take a stance again and be putting themselves back on their feet. But that's actually often the piece that's missed, is that, well, what kind of harms could befall them? And aid workers weren't able to respond to that question. So I think that's just important to think about, making sure that these organisations truly understand how their actions and data handling activities could lead right through back to harming beneficiary. And then the final slide, I'm ready for questions, if there are any.
Olivia, brilliant. Thank you very much. So if anybody's got any questions, please use the Q&A tab. Certainly at the bottom of the screen for me. I hope it's in the same position for everyone else, and I'll ask them on your behalf. But it's interesting. You're in a highly pressured situation where you know, certainly on the front line, you're collecting the data, you want to provide the support. And I'm thinking across to stories I've heard about a shipping organization who, well, Maersk, we talk quite openly about it, and how when they were attacked, they had to resort to the WhatsApps of the world, Facebooks, whatever they could do to talk to their business partners. And you think that's all very commendable, but there's a hell of a risk, and it sounds like this is just day-to-day activity in the aid world. That's right.
This is day-to-day activity, and I'm not for one moment saying that aid workers are ignorant of what goes on, or that they are always ignoring the important sort of protocols that have been identified as needed. But you're absolutely right. In these contexts, everything is chaotic. And what I really did want to try and hit home was the fact that because of this chaos, because of the nature of emergency response environments, no 2 days are the same. Things can turn on their heads in a matter of moments. The policies don't reflect those contexts. They don't respond to those realities. So if aid workers are saying, you know, we can't use the protocols that you've identified in the policy, you've had to revert or use, you know, implement using WhatsApp, then policies need to be aware of that. Senior management need to sort of take that on board and say, right, we need to put this in the policy. We need to have a proper think around what that means with regards to data security, and make sure that our aid workers understand that we know that's happening, and the kind of conversations that we need to have around that in that case. I mean, one of the things that I didn't mention on there, but aid workers, when I asked them, they said, you know, when you come back from a deployment, do you have a debrief? The majority said they don't have a debrief, which is not great given that you're in a highly traumatic situation. And then secondly, of those who did say that they did have a debrief commonly, I said, do you ever have, as part of your debrief, are you asked about your information or data handling experiences? And no, everyone who I asked that question to said they'd never been asked that question. They were never asked about their opinions, about their experiences of beneficiary data handling. And one of the things I like to try to say to people is, you know, use aid workers as frontline experts, because they really do know and have great deals of experience of what data handling is like in those really, really edgy, chaotic environments. So it's a very good litmus test as to whether policies, etc., work.
And whether you could actually write a policy that would be acceptable to people.
Right, yeah. And that's not easy either.
No, either to regulate. I was thinking, as you were talking about, well, which jurisdiction are you in? You've got an American organisation working with a French organisation in the middle of Africa.
Exactly, and so it's very, very difficult. And when I asked one of the large UK-based NGOs how they dealt with that, they said it was okay. We've got GDPR protocols in place, and policy extends to our in-country offices. But A, it doesn't need to, and B, I'm pretty sure that it's not, those GDPR prerequisites are not practiced in those in-country offices, because they don't need to be, and it's very difficult to do so anyway.
Yeah. I'll string a few questions together. So I was asked over what period the data was collected, but I'll also ask in the same frame, do you think the situation has improved since then, and how would you make things better? So 3 in 1.
Okay, you might have to remind me of a couple of those, but let's start with so I started the study in 2018 and completed it in 2021, just the very beginning of 2021. And I would say the lion's share of the information I gathered was collected in 2020. Yeah, so the latter part of 2020, sort of probably from about August through to November 2020. So
do you think it's actually changed? Do you think it's any better than when you did your surveys and your personal experience?
It's so difficult to say, because I'd need to do another study to find out.
That's the scientific answer. Gut.
Yeah, I think my gut feeling is that there's more awareness in the media. So the media is talking about all of this a lot more and reporting on all of this a lot more. And with the current conflict in Ukraine, I think there will be more and more conversations about this happening. But whether these conversations and some of the recommendations and learnings have filtered down to policy and in field environments, I'd say it's unlikely, because of a lot of the difficulties I've mentioned before.
Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes to go. So do you see that cyber or information security, the improvements should come as a collective effort across NGOs and other stakeholders? How do you see things improving?
Yeah, so there currently isn't an independent body which tracks all of this information. So all of the data handling experience of aid workers, of cyber attacks which target NGOs. And one of the recommendations I included in my study was that there needs to be some sort of single point of contact where or repository, if you like, of this information being collected. So that's one of the things that I've actually begun to work on, and will be launching in June, if all goes to plan, with the International Politics Department at Aberystwyth University. We're going to be launching a repository and research hub there of exactly this kind of information.
I guess finally, who do you think can actually influence the changes to make things better?
I think, again, everyone has a very particular role that they can play. So I think the governments, as is happening with the sort of NCSC, are applying more pressure to organisations to really take a look at this. GDPR and regulations like those add an additional pressure and force conversations to be happening internally within organisations. But I think aid workers as well, if we're focusing primarily on the humanitarian community, I think aid workers can ask questions of their organisations. How do we protect this information? And really interrogate the information that's in those policies and interrogate what they're told, because they will have, as I mentioned earlier, I really do think they're sort of frontline experts, and therefore they will know best as to whether those policies sort of comfortably lay over the experiences they've had in those deployment scenarios.
Brilliant. Olivia, thank you very much. We're exactly on time. Stunning bit of planning, well timed.
I'm not sure about planning.
So
thank you, everybody.
we've
Really
done it.
appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.